our mind that how is this going to impact India? What can India do? Welcome to Explain Live of the Indian Express. This is our online series of in-depth explanatory conversation with leading experts offering clear and insightful explanations on the issues that shape the news. This is where actually we break down the biggest stories with the sharpest minds, real conversation with domain experts on the topics making headlines as we speak right now. I am Manas Shrivastava. Now, today's issue of discussion, as I mentioned in the introduction as well, that US tariff, it's about the how are US tariffs likely to impact India and what can India do. So there can be many questions which can come in our minds. For example, what is the impact of this US tariff on other countries around the world? What can the government do or what it has done so far? How will countries like India grow in such an atmosphere? And to answer all these questions and more, I welcome you to this edition of Explain Live with Sajjid Chinoy, who is the Managing Director and Chief Asia Economist at JP Morgan. He's also the part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and he has previously served on crucial committees, including the RBI's Expert Committee to revise and strengthen the monetary policy framework. Chinoy has in the past also worked at the IMF, among other organizations. He will be in conversation with Siddharth Upasani, who is Deputy Associate Editor at the Indian Express. Now, before we take the conversation forward between Sajid and Siddharth, a little quick format what we are going to do here. Now, in the Explain Live, we generally have a conversation between, the guest and our editor. And after that, we'll also have questions. So you can keep posting your questions. We already have some questions with us, and we'll try to take as many questions as possible. Now, it is possible that many of your questions will already be addressed during the discussion, so keep watching. Also, we are live on the YouTube channel of the Indian Express, so you are also welcome to revisit and rewatch whenever you want. So over to you, Siddharth. Let's start the discussion.
Thank you, Manas. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mr. Chinoy. Welcome to another edition of Explain Live. Manas has set the stage very well, so I'll only make a few brief remarks before we begin. India currently faces a penal tariff of 25%, in addition to the reciprocal tariff of 25%, which puts India in a tough spot. India enjoyed a merchandise or goods trade surplus of over $40 billion with the US in 2024-25. Now, it faces the possibility of lower exports. To take us forward, it's best if we begin with the country which is imposing the tariffs, which is the United States. Mr. Chinoy, it's fitting that the United States has in some ways imposed these tariffs because we think of them as they are indirect taxes, and indirect taxes are regressive in nature. But prices have not really gone up in the US. If you look at the latest CPI, the Consumer Price Index print for August, which was 2.9%, sure, it's the highest since January, but it's not as high as you would like to think. If you look at, let's say, month-to-month price changes, the index has gone up by maybe 0.2, 0.3, 0.4%. So the numbers do tell us that there is inflation, unlike what the president likes to say, which is that there is zero inflation. But why haven't prices gone up as we would have thought?
Thank you, Siddharth. Good evening. Great to be here as always. So let's start with that because I think the puzzle is broader than just inflation. It's also why has growth held up so much. So let's break it down. I think the first point is to understand what the level of tariffs in the US currently are. So on Liberation Day, with all these grandiose announcements, the effective tariff rate in the US was closer to 25 or 26%. And just to put that in perspective, the tariff rate last year before Mr. Trump, because this was even worse than the tariffs you saw in the 1930s. Now, since then, the president has walked a lot of this back, right? That 26, 27% tariff, the effective rate in the US today is about 17 or 18%, which is still very high. These are the levels you saw in the 1930s. But the effective rate is about 17 or 18%. And more importantly, there are many sectoral exemptions. Semiconductors, electronics are exempt, right? Generic pharmaceuticals are exempt. There are other exemptions. So even the effective rate is lower than April, but more importantly, the actual realized rate is closer to 10%. So what do I mean by a realized rate? When you look at the tariff revenues actually collected at the border every month, divide by the total imports that month, you get the realized tariff rate. That's 10%. So we've gone from 3% to 10%. We haven't gone from 10% all the way to 17% yet, which is where we should eventually land up. Why? There are three reasons, right? First is many importers, in anticipation of tariffs coming, front-loaded in January, February, March. So inventories are very higher, much higher, and the goods you're selling are the pre-tariff goods. So you're importing less of those goods at this point in time. More importantly, there is substitution across countries. China's effective tariff rate is 42%. The effective tariff rate in ASEAN is 18%. US importers are buying more goods from ASEAN and less from China, so to take advantage of the tariff arbitrage. So number two, so trade volumes have changed a lot. This effective rate that I spoke about of 17% presumed that trade would be the same as volumes would be the same as last year, but volumes are dynamic and reflect changing prices, right? And the third is even the composition of goods has changed. People have, kind of moved towards lower tariff goods. So for a variety of reasons, the effective tariff rate is 10%. But my sense is when all of these, the front loading reverses, that number is slowly going to go up towards 16 or 17%. So the first reason we haven't seen higher inflation is the effective rate is today 10. It's not 17. And it's not the 26% that was feared on Liberation Day. Number two, a lot depends on how much is absorbed by the importer and how much is passed on to the consumer. The typical rule of thumb is, by the end of a year or two, the consumer sees the vast majority of it. But importers tend to pass this on slowly. When you're facing a 20% tariff rate, you can't increase prices 20% in one go. You're going to lose your market share. So you're going to increase prices and homeopathic doses over 6, 12, 18 months. So the second reason that's not showing up in consumer prices is importers have absorbed the bulk of this, and over time, more and more will be passed on, to consumers. So, and the third is, let's not be deceived by year-on-year inflation rates because they are 12-month over 12-month. Look at the month-on-month numbers. That's a better gauge of momentum. What do you see? The last 2 months, core consumer price in the US have gone up 0.35%. That means on an annualized rate, inflation is actually already above 4%. So I think these are the three reasons why that the effective tariff rate is lower, importers are absorbing more, and the year-on-year rates are deceptively stable, right? It's the momentum that matters. Let me make one more quick point to that, which is that even growth has been stronger, right? So when we speak about what's happened in the US, when you impose tariffs, that's an adverse supply shock. You should expect to see higher inflation and lower growth. There was one more adverse supply shock in the form of immigration, which is not spoken about as much. You had millions of immigrants coming in previous years under Biden. That actually boosted growth. It meant that there were more workers looking for jobs, and so wages in the US didn't go up, and there was a cap on inflation, and that was responsible for US exceptionalism. Now, under Mr. Trump, not only have those that immigration virtually halted, but you're seeing deportations, right? And so what you're now seeing is a negative supply shock even on immigration. So there are two reinforcing adverse supply shocks on tariffs and people. So it's goods and people. So why is growth holding up? Third quarter growth in the US is going to be 3%, right? Which is very high. Well, the simple reason for that is all of this growth is very narrow and it's coming from all this AI euphoria / mania. We're seeing unprecedented investments in equipment investment, right? Data centers, servers, GPUs, integrated circuits. The hyperscalers are ramping up dramatically. So the contribution of equipment investment in GDP is through the roof. And it's this very narrow sector that's keeping printed GDP numbers higher. If you look outside of that, what you actually see are really worrying signs in the labor market. If you look at the US labor market the last 3 months, it's virtually come to a stall. So I would say let's not get carried away by the headline GDP numbers, which are being driven by a very small sector. the broader economy is facing more pressures. Labor markets have slowed sharply, labor income is slowing, and the inflation drags are just building. Expect to see those inflation numbers go up in the coming months. So households now have a double whammy. Not only is your labor income slowing because the job market is slowing, but you've got a purchasing power squeeze coming because inflation is about to pick up. So I think the outlook is far more cloudy than what is made out to be.
You mentioned 3% for the third quarter, which is July, September, is what is expected. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, they have this now costing model. I think their latest number is 3.8%, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
While we do expect inflation to finally rise, the headline numbers to start showing the effect and growth to moderate as the labor market continues to weaken. What sort of a time horizon should we be considering to see these numbers? Because before the tariffs, the constant warnings that we heard were that there was going to be a recession. I think the first quarter the US economy did shrink by, I think, half a percentage point or 0.6%. But since then, like you mentioned, the AI and other investments have been propping up the headline number. And it's every other day we hear of new investment by either OpenAI or some other large AI company. When should we start seeing these numbers reflecting reality?
It's a very good question, right? And I think the next 2 or 3 quarters becomes really important, because one view of the world is that the drags are building, that in the next 6 months as inflation picks up and the job market slows, right? Consumption is everything in the US. So if the US consumer were to downshift very sharply, that creates a big risk that the US economy goes into recession, even if one narrow sector like tech is booming, right? So if things have to break, it'll have to be in the next 3 quarters or so. If we get through the next 2 or 3 quarters unscathed, right, and I can tell you why that may happen, then the odds of a recession will be much lower. For what it's worth, JP Morgan, our global team, still puts the odds of a recession in the next 4 quarters at about 40%. So it's not the base scenario, it's about 40%. Now, the question is, is the softening in the labor market signal or noise? Because last year you had a similar softening in the labor market, and then jobs recovered later in the year. If that is the case, that the last 2-3 months have been more noise and the job market recovers and labor income stabilize, then consumers will be able to absorb these inflation hits better and the economy will not go into recession. Right? My worry is that this year is different from last year. We're in a government shutdown, so there's a data blackout. But if you look at the vast preponderance of the labor market data, by all indications, it's slowing. And if you look at past records, the labor market never stabilizes at these low levels. When you're at 20, 30,000, you typically slip into contraction. So employers so far have stopped hiring, but they've not started firing. And that's the key known unknown. If the behavioral response goes from, well, there's so much uncertainty that I don't need more workers, to, well, the outlook doesn't look good, let me start firing workers. I think that's the signal that you may go into recession. One last complicating factor, as if the outlook is not complicated enough, because of the changing immigration patterns, economists don't have a good sense of what the break-even rate in the US is. What does that mean? It means, what is the number of jobs required to ensure the unemployment rate doesn't go up? When you had large immigration flows, you required 80,000, 100,000 jobs a month. Now with immigration reversing, maybe the break-even rate is 20 or 30,000. So maybe even if we remain at 20 or 30,000 new jobs every month, the unemployment rate will not spike. So I just want to say there are a lot of known unknowns. Push comes to shove, our sense is still there's a 40% chance that over the next 3 or 4 quarters, the US slips into recession. If it can navigate past the next 3 quarters, then the odds are that you've come out of this episode. Very, very final point. It matters a lot how quickly tariffs are imposed. If one were to say tariffs go from 3% to 18% over a 5-year period, nobody would have forecasted a recession. When you say tariffs go from 3% to 18% in 3 quarters, then you forecast a recession. So if this tariff increase is staggered out over 6-8 quarters, for whatever reason, importers don't pass these prices on, they keep absorbing more of it in terms of a margin hit, then the odds are that the US will escape a recession going forward. It'll be a downshift, growth will slow, but not go into a recession.
inflation, growth, and the labor market. I mean, these are the things which the US Federal Reserve, the central bank, looks at. And amid all these changing dynamics, Donald Trump has repeatedly called on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates sharply. Last month, the Fed cut the federal funds rate target range by 25 basis points, the first time in 2025. And the projections of the Fed members suggest another 50 basis points of cuts in what remains of 2025. How difficult has the Fed's job been trying to navigate not just the economic data, but as well as the moral suasion of sorts from the US government?
The Fed is in a very, very unenviable position at this point in time. And I think there are three different sources of uncertainty that it has to navigate. The first is what you alluded to, Siddharth, which is, when I spoke about these adverse supply shocks, they're called stagflatory. In other words, inflation goes up and growth goes down. Now, for a central bank, that's very hard to navigate. See, if things are moving in the same direction, growth is going down, inflation is going down, it's very easy, you know what to do. If growth is picking up and inflation is picking up, you know you need to tighten. But what happens when inflation is elevated or rising and and jobs are slowing and growth is slowing? How do you navigate that? Our sense has always been that given the starting point here, where US interest rates are still very elevated, they're in restrictive territory, that the Fed would have an asymmetric reaction function. If there was a little bit of inflation, it would look through it to see if there were second-round effects. But the minute the job market came under pressure, remember the Fed has a dual mandate. It has to look at inflation and unemployment rate. The minute the jobs market showed signs of breaking or cracking, the Fed would cut. And therefore, Chairman Powell, I think, correctly characterized the first cut as being an insurance cut. We're not sure whether the jobs market is going to break, but you'd rather make a type 1 error and preemptively cut to protect the jobs market than make a type 2 error and be too late. I think that's why another cut in October is pretty much guaranteed, because you want to do at least 50 basis points until you have more clarity. Now, the second source of uncertainty is this data blackout. The Fed is now flying blind because what was really important was the September jobs number that was supposed to come out last Friday. There was no jobs report. So now the Fed is operating with no data at all, right? And hopefully the US government shutdown will not last so long, and there'll be some more data for the Fed in the coming weeks or months. But I think the next rate cut is even without data the Fed will do, because it's called this insurance easing. The larger problem, of course, is political independence. That's a much larger institutional concern. We saw in the last Fed meeting that all the other governors outside of Stephen Moran rallied around behind the governor because they understand. Why is this so important? Because the bedrock of US exceptionalism has been, or the bedrock of most economies that grow strongly and are attractive from an investor's perspective, is that you have an independent central bank, right? And once the independence of the central bank goes away, that entire edifice begins to crack. What you're seeing in the US is something very interesting, which you normally don't see in developed markets. You only see this in emerging markets, which is when bond yields at the long end harden. So what economists call term premia go up. Typically at that point in time when yields harden and interest rates go up, currencies strengthen because you've got higher interest rates. The opposites happen in the US. The currency is weakened. So when the currency is weakening and term premia are going up, that suggests that country risk premia have risen. So these concerns around institutional independence are very real, and let's hope that we're not in a situation where that is compromised going forward.
I mean, while we have the tariffs, they're also generating revenue for the government. The monthly tariff revenue for the US has gone up from less than $10 billion in early 2025, 2024 to more than 30 billion now. What can the US government do with this money? I mean, reducing debt has been something which the Trump administration has repeatedly talked about. But is there any other route that the government can go?
Well, I have some news, which is that this money's already been spent, right? There was a large fiscal bill earlier this year. There were very large corporate tax cuts. I would dare to say it was a very regressive piece of fiscal legislation where upper income people got tax cuts, corporates got tax cuts, and the bottom of the pyramid didn't get very much. Now, those tax cuts were going to be financed in part by tariff revenues. So in a way, an indirect tax cut, which is regressive, as you pointed out correctly, will be financing a direct tax cut. Now, so that this comes this comes to a place which not many people realize. There is a big cloud hanging over these tariffs because the Supreme Court on the 5th of November is going to hear a case about the legality of IEPA. So IEPA is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act that the president used to impose reciprocal tariffs and fentanyl tariffs, right? And so including the tariffs on India, for example, come under IEPA. Now, the US Court of International Trade has ruled this to be illegal. The Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. has supported that decision, and now the Supreme Court's going to hear this, right? If the Supreme Court reinforces the decision of the earlier courts and IEPA is made invalid, then you're thrown into all kinds of uncertainty. The first order issue will have to be that most likely the US Treasury will have to refund some of the tariff revenues. The total tariff revenues collected so far is about $190 billion, which is not small. Now, 2/3 of this come from IEPA. So the US to refund it. And it means that unless you raise other sources of revenue, it's going to put humongous fiscal pressure. And again, put pressure on the long end of the yield curve. The question is, how does the Trump administration respond? Our sense is they've got many other provisions under the law that they can use to substitute IEPA. Under Section 122, you can impose a 15% tariff, or you can impose a temporary tariff for 150 days. So you may well see if IEPA is invalidated, there's a 15% tariff on all countries for 150 days. Under Section 232 of the law, you can essentially have sector-specific tariffs. So iron and steel that you've seen, pharmaceuticals, all of those, the furniture ones that came, are all under Section 232, which require investigations. And there's another Section 301 that was used to put tariffs on China in the first Trump presidency, which will require more legwork. You have to prove that countries are being unfair at trade. So this will become very messy if the Supreme Court rules against the administration. It will mean that the fiscal will come under pressure. We think the Trump administration will not lie low. They will retaliate by putting on Section 232 and 301 and 122, but it means heightened uncertainty for trading partners in this environment.
You mentioned the word messy. We are still in the first year of the Trump administration. Are we resigned to another 3 years of legal battles? Because the president does not shy away from those. So you said they will rebut and try and find new ways. Is that the way forward for the US, a mix of foreign and trade policy?
I mean, I think the president's revealed preference is very clear over the last 6-7 months, and I think that will not change. And to be fair, this was all telegraphed much before the election. I mean, we're surprised at what the US president has done, but that's exactly what Project 2025 was about, where the president did signal his priorities were going to be tariffs, they were going to be immigration, they were going to be tax cuts. And on each of these, whether you like it or not, they have achieved the objectives they laid out. So I think this will continue. I think the only thing that investors look at is to look at the midterm elections next year. Will there be any change in the balance of power in the House or the Senate? It's more likely the House than the Senate. And then does Congress become a check on executive authority? But that is still, we're looking at 13 months away.
Just moving away from the enforcer to the impacted, the trade relationship that has dominated discussions globally has been that of between the US and China. But you wrote in a column for the Indian Express last month that the real pressure from the tariff is likely to fall on emerging markets and developing economies because they're going to be hit by multiple shocks: tariffs, trade diversion, changes in technology. What can emerging market economies do when faced with such unprecedented risks?
I think that is the defining question that emerging markets face, and I think that's getting glossed over in all this focus by analysts on what's happening in the US. Will there be a recession? Why is there not more inflation? What will Mr. Trump do? Focus on China. What fiscal response will there be? How are the anti-involution efforts panning out? We're focusing so much on the day-to-day and the week-to-week that if you step back, I worry that the outlook for emerging markets outside of China has become much more cloudy and much more challenging. And I just elaborate briefly on the three measures you said. the fact is that trade and exports have been the lifeblood of emerging market growth over the last 25 years. If you draw a chart of emerging market GDP growth, right, ex-China for the last 25 years, and you draw another line of global trade volumes, they're the same line. In other words, emerging markets have leaned heavily on global trade to grow exports and therefore GDP growth. And so in a world that's becoming far more protectionist, we're speaking about the US, which is the largest country in the world, raising tariffs to 17%, the highest since the 1930s. What we also have to realize is that non-tariff barriers began to increase back in COVID. Some of these may have been justified for national security, and that's a slippery slope. Now we're seeing non-tariff barriers increase around the world. So we're in a situation where the global economy is becoming far more protectionist. There was talk about Europe now imposing tariffs on other countries as a knock-on effect of what the US is doing on Europe. We know some countries in Asia and Mexico are contemplating tariffs on China. In other words, we're in a very different regime now than we were for the last 25 years, right? And the question is, how do emerging markets grow if you don't have exports to rely on, as a growth engine? The second shock is, we spoke about, we haven't touched on the fact that why did the US even put on tariffs? Because Mr. Trump worried that, Chinese exports to the US in the early 2000s led to a hollowing out of jobs in the US, and the manufacturing base got hollowed out. It was called the China shock to the US. I worry that there's a China shock 2.0 that's coming the way of emerging markets. That's because China is sitting on large excess capacity. Domestic demand has been soft. It needs to export this capacity out. The US has put on high tariffs on China. The effective tariff rate on China is 42%. So if China can't export to the US, guess what? China is going to redirect those exports to the rest of the world. And we're already seeing that in the last 6-8 months, strong Chinese exports to ASEAN, to the Middle East, to North Africa, to Latin America. So now emerging markets have a second shock. First is, exports become hard in this more protectionist world. But now you're worried about your domestic manufacturing base being hollowed out by cheap Chinese imports. So you also have to play defense at home to ensure that these cheap Chinese imports don't hollow out your manufacturing base. And the third shock is, so this is the trade diversion shock. And the third is technology. This is a longer issue where, around the world, manufacturing has become more and more automated. Now the risk of AI on all jobs and service jobs. So if you look at capital labor ratios for every unit of output, the world and emerging markets, and including in India, we're using more machines and fewer people, right? And so if you're an emerging market like India and you've got this runway of 10 years where you've got a young demography, lots of people coming into the labor force, right? How do you create jobs? And so for me, it's this potent combination of tariffs, trade diversion, and technology that stares emerging markets. You asked what should emerging markets do? I'll just end 30 seconds to say, I think it'll be a mistake to turn inward. It'll be a mistake to turn inward. My favorite statistic, only 13 economies since the Second World War have grown at 7% or more for 25 years on average. That is something India needs to emulate. All those 13 economies had one thing in common. They all grew on the back of exports. They all grew on the back of strong global engagement. So India has to now, and other emerging markets cannot give up on the global engine, on the export engine. In fact, the attitude we have to take is we should do WTO -1 or WTO -2. The US only accounts for 15% of all global imports. So if the US doesn't want to play ball, the rest of the world, can form a rules-based trading regime, right? And trade amongst each other. India, I think, should take the lead when it comes to that in the global south. Very encouraging that, we have a trade deal with the UK. Hopefully we'll have a trade deal with the EU. Those send strong signals out. So A, I think you should not turn inward. B, I think emerging markets will have to look at themselves in the mirror, that this is a moment of reckoning. This is a world where the premium for being competitive, both competing in exports and competing against Chinese imports, means you have to be very competitive. And that requires foundational reforms, right? Land, labor, power across the emerging market universe. How do you make your economies more competitive? Two more things. because capital labor ratios are so large, how do you give labor a better chance to compete with capital? You see, with AI and with automation, productivity of capital is very large. So how do you ensure that when people are choosing the mix between machines and people, that people have a fair chance? How can labor compete with capital? And the only way is education, skilling, health, making sure labor laws don't unduly punish labor itself. So you have to create an ecosystem where labor can become more productive and compete with capital. And the very final thing is and this holds true for the US in particular and for the whole world, we're in this period of rapid technological change where every day what's a sunrise industry today quickly becomes a sunset industry. So with so much turmoil and so much economic dynamism, you need to have economies that allow creative destruction. Where as new industries develop, you want to create an economic system where capital and labor, can move seamlessly from one industry to another. You provide the training, the reskilling, and you create a safety net for those left behind. So it's a long agenda, but I think one that all emerging markets will have to confront in the years to come.
I think that's a good time to move to India now. I mean, the penal 25% tariff that came into effect on 27th of August was a kick in the teeth. Just this week, the World Bank has reduced its GDP growth forecast for India for 2026-27 to 6.3%, which is 20 basis points lower from earlier. And most of it is being explained as the adverse impact of the cumulative 50% tariff. What do you make of the growth and inflation data starting, let's say, April this year?
So there are a lot of known unknowns. I think you've got, the way I think about this is India's macro outlook is external headwinds that have to compete with domestic tailwinds. And we can take each of these in turn. So I think the headwinds are clear. It's largely US tariffs. The tariffs are 50%, but given the exemptions of electronics and others and pharmaceuticals, the effective tariff rate on India is about 34%, which is large, right? Now, I think the key is going to be how long this lasts. If let's hope and pray we get a trade deal in the next few weeks or a month, then this is just a small blip, right? But if this lingers on for longer, then there will be costs. There's India's exports to the US are about 2.3% of GDP. A quarter of that is exempt currently. So the exports that face tariffs are 1.7% of GDP. But remember, you have to look at the value add, not just the gross exports, because some of these sectors like gems and jewelry, you have very large import content. So the value addition is about 1.1% of GDP. So there's 1% of GDP that's at risk because of these higher tariffs. But I think the real issue, challenge is that most of these are in very labor-intensive sectors. Gems and jewelry, leather, textiles, footwear, shrimps, and marine products. So what you don't want is for this to linger on very much because a lot of these are small enterprises. The US is a big consumer. If demand suddenly shuts down, then you worry about the viability of these enterprises, and you don't want there to be job losses, which then have knock-on effects on consumption. So hopefully, the earlier we can get a deal, the better. That's the headwind. I think that's what people are focusing on. But we shouldn't forget that at least at the macro level, there are now some offsetting forces when it comes to domestic demand. There are 6 tailwinds that are developing, domestically. One is very benign inflation. Inflation this year, even before the GST cuts, was going to average 2.5%. Very low inflation means purchasing power for households picks up, and that should help consumption. Number 2, we had a very good monsoon, another strong monsoon. So the combination of low inflation and the good monsoon means rural demand has finally begun to pick up. But there are other supporting factors. Third, we had direct tax cuts in the budget, about 0.3% of GDP. Fourth, we now have GST cuts, somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6% of GDP. You've had rate cuts earlier this year, which are working their way through the system. So lending rates have begun to come off. And you've had meaningful regulatory easing by the RBI just last week. So you have a situation where domestic demand can be expected to pick up in the next few months because you've got direct tax cuts, indirect tax cuts, lower interest rates, more regulatory easing, good monsoon, lower inflation. So the outlook really at this point is very murky because you've got these tailwinds that are helping domestic demand, but you've got exports which come under the cloud because of what's happening on the US front. I think the key to mitigate the external headwind is just to preserve the viability of these enterprises, for policy to provide a bridge, until hopefully a trade deal can be struck.
When it comes to purchase of goods inside a country, the delivery lags can be fairly short. I mean, just the other day I placed an order for a pair of shoes, and I just got a message saying that they've been delivered to my home. International trade, though, the lags are much longer. Orders, especially large ones, have to be placed well in advance. When can we expect the monthly trade data that the government releases to start showing the impact of the tariffs, or have they already started reflecting that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. My sense is the first signs will come in the September trade data. So we looked at the August trade data in detail because we now have the commodity breakdown of the August number. At the aggregate level, nothing much has happened, and you would expect that. August was too soon. The first set of tariffs kicked in the first week. The next set kicked in the last week. And remember, what we saw earlier in the year was front-loading of exports by India to the US, just like every other country in Asia had front-loaded to the US before anticipated tariffs. So now, you saw exports to the US pick up. By August, that front loading had reversed. Now, interestingly, if you look deeper into the August data, you do find that for some of these affected sectors, gems and jewelry, textiles, right, that you have seen a decline in exports to the US, but the overall export number has not fallen as much. That is a very interesting kind of development because it tells you that while exports to the US have gotten hurt, exporters have been able to, for now at least, to find other markets. It's only 1 month's data. It's August. I would not draw too many conclusions. I think from September onwards, we'll have a much better year. I think September, October, we'll get a sense of, look at the trade data, look at the IP data, we'll look at the credit data, look at the employment data, we'll have a much better sense then.
I just want to come back to inflation, India's inflation. You mentioned that even before the GST rate cuts, we're already looking at an average of 2.5% for 2025-26. Early next year, we'll have the Statistics Ministry updating the CPI, where the food weight will be lower, and hopefully that will lead to lower volatility in the inflation numbers, as well as possibly even lower inflation as such. Does that put more pressure on the RBI to cut rates in the lead up or after that, considering that it will have room to do so? And I'm assuming it wouldn't want inflation to stay below 4%, its medium-term target, for too long.
So my sense is that inflation has come out much below than had been feared a few months ago. And it's good to break this down because core inflation has always been very benign. And especially if you measure core inflation correctly, take out the impact of gold, core has been very benign. And that's not surprising. It's something we've been writing about, that you've got China's excess capacity exerting large disinflationary forces on the world and in Asia in particular. And India is, a beneficiary of that. Well, beneficiary or it's a cost depending on if you're a competitor. But also, if you look at emerging markets, including India, we're still a few percentage points below our pre-pandemic potential path. That tells you that there's still some slack in the economy. And so the combination of that slack and the Chinese disinflationary forces has meant that for the last 12 or 15 months, core inflation has been very benign. Food prices have been much more volatile, but thankfully we're now on the right end of the food inflation slope. The pulses, for example, has a cobweb cycle, and now we're benefiting from that cobweb cycle. We've had 2 strong monsoons, right? So there's confidence now that at least for the foreseeable future, core is going to remain stable and food is going to disinflate. And I think the RBI correctly said that maybe some space for easing is opening up. But I think they were right to wait in the last meeting because, again, there's so many known unknowns. We don't know whether a trade deal will be struck in the next couple of months and therefore what the macro outlook is. B, fiscal policy has been activated now, right? That you've seen these GST cuts. And so it makes sense for monetary and fiscal to stagger themselves out. By December, the RBI will have much more information. A, whether you had a trade deal. B, what has been the impact of these GST cuts on consumption and on domestic demand, right? And so I think they were prudent to wait. And my sense is, yes, a little bit of space does open up. If inflation remains very benign, there's probably 25, 50 basis points of space that can be used if needed in the coming months.
Okay, just a final question from me before we open the floor for our audience. What do you make of the trade deal negotiations themselves? The penalty tariff for importing oil and arms from Russia threw a spanner in the works, but discussions have taken off again. What can India hope for let's say, in a best and worst case scenario?
Yeah, I think in a best, it's very encouraging that trade negotiations are back on. I think what India can hope for in a best case scenario is that the negotiations stick to economics. Because I think if this is only about trade, I think there is a deal to be done here. And it's understandable why. If India were to get preferential access to US markets for labor-intensive exports, that's very good for India. India is a large market, it's growing every year. If the US were to get lower tariffs into India's market, that's good for the US. So I'm a very old-fashioned economist where trade is win-win. Both parties can win. This is not a zero-sum game where if one party is winning, the other has to lose. This is a positive-sum game. And so I think if the negotiations are limited to economics and trade, hopefully a deal can be struck. For me, it's the uncertainty that the disciplines of uncertainty which is important when a deal is struck. The worst case scenario is that we continue in this environment where the problem is it's not clear what the US president wants because the ball keeps the goalpost keeps changing, right? First reason we have to shift that to the market of oil, global market for oil. Very few countries, OPEC plus neither US shale, will be able to service that demand. So if India were to stop buying Russian crude and buy it on the open market, guess what? Global crude prices would spike and US consumers would be among the worst hit. So I think the worst case scenario is that the goalpost keeps changing and we don't make progress. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the US will realize the virtues of a win-win for a country like India and eventually some deal can be struck. I think the key is that if that takes time, that we should continue with. There was a precedent in COVID where when there was a sudden demand shutdown, there were some measures we deployed to keep economic enterprises alive. And I think it'd be prudent if the deal takes time to employ those COVID-like measures, right? Provide liquidity support, provide regulatory forbearance, provide targeted fiscal support, because we know exactly which sectors and which firms largely export to the US. So the key is you want to keep these enterprises alive for the next 3-4 months till a deal can be struck. And I think that would kind of need to be the near-term policy focus.
Okay, great. I think we can open the floor for questions now. We have a question from Anisha Chavan. Anisha, could you unmute yourself and perhaps ask a question? Anisha? Okay, we'll come back to her.
We can move to the next one, yeah.
Yeah, we have Debasish Debnath.
Debasish is not there, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, okay, we'll move to the next one. Arumugam PK. Arumugam?
We can keep
Okay.
moving to the next one. So
All right. Manoj Jain. Okay. GR Ekbote. Dr. GR Ekbote. All right. Manoj P.
let's take the last one. I think Ram Kayarat is here. Ram Kayarat. Yeah, Ram, can you just unmute yourself and take the question? Ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. So my question was basically, which are the sectors or the businesses that are more impacted in terms of the percentage or in terms of the revenue? And if you were to look at markets outside of the US, like in terms of the businesses that have been most impacted, which would those be? And there's a small question that I don't know whether it's relevant or not. Is this a Trump master stroke or just a political stunt? And sir, if allowed, I mean, if I get a second chance, I had another question, but only if I'm allowed.
We can come to you. We can come to you in the second.
Sure.
If that's
Thank you
fine.
so much.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, very much.
Well, the second part of the question is easier to answer. Is this a Trump masterstroke? I can't speak politically. I can speak economically. I think when you put on tariffs of these levels, this is a very large tax on U.S. households. A, B, it really impinges on global efficiency, right? And once you see, not only will U.S. inflation pick up, but this in a way forces a misallocation of resources globally, right? C, if there is an attack on U.S. institutions, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's academic institutions, these have been at the heart of US outperformance or US exceptionism in the last 50, 60 years. So I don't see how this is a political masterstroke. I think the puzzle rightly is, well, why is there no pernicious effect showing up as yet? And my point is, these things always take longer. Rudy Dornbush, a very famous economist, once said, in economics, things always take longer to happen. But when they do, they happen much faster. So I think we need to reserve judgment on this. And I'll say one other thing, while Trump may be right about the symptom, I want to increase manufacturing jobs, the medicine that's being used is the wrong one, right? Even if you were to jawbone manufacturers to build factories in the US, manufacturing has become far more automated right now. You will create the value add, but you won't create the jobs, right? So if you're looking for boosting manufacturing employment in the US, which is a noble objective, then the prescription is a much harder slog. It's retraining, it's reskilling, it's education, it's getting people fit for jobs of the future. So I'm not in the camp that believes that this is a masterstroke. As far as which sectors are weak, as a macroeconomist, I can look top down. But you can see that in some of these sectors, the US is a large market. So I'm looking at a list right now. Clothing and textiles, the share of the US in total exports is 30%, which is not small, right? Smartphones, it's 30%. Leather, it's 25%, right? Stone and glass, it's 30%. Gems and jewelry is 30%. So the sectors where tariffs have been imposed, the US is a meaningful, is a meaningful customer, meaningful market, 25 to 30%. And that's the worry that there'll suddenly be a demand shutdown. I think the medium term has to be export diversification, which is why it's really important that the India-EU trade deal go through. I'll go a step further and I'll say we have to also look towards Asia. In the next 20 years, Asia is going to be where all the growth dynamism is going to come from, right? So you want to trade with Asia. CPTPP has a lot of Asian countries trading. So India perhaps at some point needs to think of joining a mega regional as well, so that you have more markets and you're less exposed to the US market.
I think we can take Anisha now. Anisha is back, I think. Anisha, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So my question is, first of all, thank you so much for this. My question is, if US tariffs are designed to reduce dependence on China, then why hasn't India captured a larger share of redirected manufacturing despite being a China +1 destination? Also, what structural reforms are genuinely needed versus politically palatable?
These are great questions. And so, the hope for many Asian economies has been that the US-China kind of strategic competition has been reinforced by the events of the last 8-9 months, right? And so, if businesses recognize that there are risks of relocating or concentrating only in China, and there'd be extra emphasis on diversification outside of China, and that's what you should hope to see. Now, this began in the last trade war under Trump 1.0. And at that point, what you saw was ASEAN was a big beneficiary. Vietnam, Malaysia, right, were big beneficiaries. Now what you're seeing is that ASEAN is being painted in the same brush as China. One of the reasons why US inflation hasn't gone up and effective tariff rates are not higher is you're seeing a lot of transshipment of Chinese goods through Vietnam and through Thailand to the US. And the US has threatened transshipment tariffs on ASEAN. This creates a real opportunity for India, right? Because now if ASEAN is thought to be in the same orbit as China, if you're a firm and you want to diversify away from China, you'd want to go beyond ASEAN. And that's why India would appear ex ante as an attractive market. Now, that's why it's good that India get a trade deal with the US, because you want to take away that source of uncertainty. If businesses are convinced that India-US relations are back on track, there's a competitive tariff, compared to other ASEAN economies. Currently, we're higher than other ASEAN economies without the trade deal. With the trade deal, hopefully, we'll be in the same bracket or lower. That increases the push factor for businesses to relocate to India and diversify from China will increase. The other signal is that apart from the trade deal with the US, if we're doing more trade deals, you're sending a powerful signal to multinational firms that India is very much open for business and committed to an export growth model. What are the things we can do? One is, in the last few years, import tariffs have begun to come down. I think import tariffs need to come, that process should continue. The first rule of trade is an import tariff is equivalent to an export tax, the Lerner symmetry theorem. So if you want to boost exports, you have to be very competitive in imports, because most of these global value chains have a lot of intra-industry, intermediate goods trade between countries, right? So that's one. And I think, India has to continue down the reform path. We're seeing this happen across states, but, ultimately foundational reforms, land, labor, power, right? You want to make India a competitive manufacturing base. What we've seen in the last few months on GST, rationalization, taking away uncertainty, simplification, really important. Now we've got to keep going down that path. Labor laws were already passed by Parliament back in 2019-20. States have not fully implemented them. Hopefully states will implement those labor laws as well. So there's a lot that can be done. We've come a long way. There's still much more that needs to be done in the coming years.
I think we have Arumugam back with us. Arumugam, if you could ask a question. You are on mute.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Depending on these increase in the tariff by Trump, what will happen to the immigration, especially the green card holders and those waiting for approval of the green card? Does it have an effect on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I won't know the details of what's happening on green card because the US policymakers have decided that, but let's step back. I think what's clear what the direction of travel is, right? Which is that first there were tariffs on goods. Then there were curbs on unskilled immigration coming from the neighboring countries. Now there are curbs on skilled immigration in the form of H-1B visas, right? So I think the direction of travel is very clear that they want to curb immigration is not a word that policymakers in Western economies at this point embrace. Now, what are the implications of that? I think in a strange way, this will boost more services offshoring, right? Currently, if you look at Indian IT companies, for example, there's a 70-30 model where you keep 70% of your workers here and 30% of your workers in the US. But in the pandemic, we saw that it moved towards more people offshore and fewer people onshore. So if multinational companies worry that getting people physically into the US or into Europe tomorrow, for instance, is a problem, you will be inclined more and more to offshore services. And that stands to India's advantage. We often forget that the real revelation the last 5 years has been India's service exports. Service exports have been surging since the pandemic, all right? And I think the runway for that is long because in the next decade, you're going to have global population aging. The West is going to need young workers. India will be one of those countries with young people, A. But B, immigration has become a really bad word. So you can't physically move people to those economies. But the good news is technology is making more and more services that were non-tradable 5 years ago, increasingly tradable. So this work can be done offshore. So I think The near term could be a little bit of a hit on H-1B visas, but I think the medium term, this will induce more people to move to offshore business, and that India should gain from those service exports.
Great. We have Chandrasekhar with us. Mr. Chandrasekhar Nene, if you could ask a question.
Yeah. Good evening, and it was a very great discussion. Thank you, Sajjid. My question is it only a one-way trade with US that US keeps hitting us with tariffs and we are not able to counter-strike in any which way? We are not that poor nation anymore, I guess. We keep calling ourselves a budding superpower. Isn't there any which way we can counter-strike so that US understands the lesson well and then behaves properly? I'm just wondering.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question. I know this is a common sentiment. Why don't we escalate? But I'll just say, India runs large trade surpluses both on goods, but more importantly on services. And my personal view is there's no benefit here from escalation. And we just spoke about the tariffs on goods. The real vulnerability is services. It's about 7% of GDP of Indian service exports to the US. Right now, if there's a tax put on service exports, that will hit hard. There is already a hires bill, not an act yet, that's been introduced in the Senate that is called for a tax on offshoring. So I'm not in the camp that believes that there is any a benefit here from tit for tat escalation. At this point, I think what the government has done has been very mature. Be calm, be practical, keep negotiating, and keep emotion out of the way. India has a lot to gain if we can get a trade deal with the US, not just the direct exports, but as I said, creating an ecosystem where we can attract more FDI and are seen as a viable China plus one destination.
I see that we have more than 50 questions in our Q&A chat box. Manas, could you perhaps just take a couple of them?
I was listening to the conversation very closely. At the same time, my attention was divided on the number of questions. Dr. Sajjid, there are a lot of questions which talk about not only causes but impact, but something which strikes my attention is most of the viewers also want to talk about the industry specific impact. For example, we have one question already, Manoj, is talking about textile market. The second one, which is hitting our, the mailbox, is on pharma industry. And the third is, we've little bit covered about it, of talking about gold and, the jewelry and all these kind of things. So what is your take on these specific industries?
Well, I think for pharmaceuticals, we're okay for now, unless it's branded, because while branded pharmaceuticals have attracted tariffs, generic pharmaceuticals have not. So I think that's one sector that hopefully we're safe from. The other ones, as I mentioned, it is a concern because value add may not be high, but these are very labor intensive sectors. And again, that's why it's important to get a deal. In the medium term, we have to diversify this outside the US. Yes, domestic demand is picking up. So if external demand is slowing, hopefully there's some offset in terms of domestic demand picking up. But the priority needs to be that you need to keep these enterprises alive. I think because there was some front loading of exports, if this was the first month or so, it's okay. People have already sold what they were going to sell in August, September, earlier in the year. But it's important that if the negotiations take long, that COVID-like measures, liquidity, regulatory forbearance, fiscal support, just keep these firms alive. Once a firm goes under, then the impact becomes very non-linear, because then it's hard to recreate the firm. You lose the institutional capital, the entrepreneurial capital, the jobs. So I think if we can protect firms, in these crucial sectors, SMEs to start with, the larger firms have more buffers to wait for a few months. At least protect the small firms. And there was a very good playbook from the pandemic. And then hopefully the deal comes before long, then we can escape the worst impact.
If I could just have a follow-up, Manas. You mentioned SMEs. MSMEs for a few years now have been facing difficulties. There have been lots of schemes which have been announced for them to push credit towards them. If negotiations go on for too long, like you said, let's say 3-4 months, where does that excess labor go? Does it go back to agriculture? does it go somewhere else?
Now, we don't want that to happen. So there was an ECLGS scheme that worked very well in the pandemic, the Emergency Credit Guarantee Scheme, which just ensured that it was fully guaranteed by the government. It was collateral free. It was just providing that credit to firms for working capital requirements, and to, almost like a furlough, to ensure that you have liquidity to avoid shedding labor. So I think we've done something in the pandemic that worked well. And I think that's one option that the government, I'm sure, is considering, right? Because you don't want, as you said, for workers to leave these firms, lose their skills and go back to agriculture. So hopefully that is something that the government's, thinking through seriously about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sajjid and Siddharth. First of all, there are so many questions. It's so difficult to select and pick. But as you know, sometimes Explain Live, and I think mostly Explain Live, become like a master class for us to learn so many things, to get so many questions answered by experts. And this is exactly what is happening today. A lot of questions which we were supposed to take but were already answered during the discussion between you and Siddharth. So we will, thank you, Dr. Sajjid, for this enriching discussion. Thank you, Siddharth, for moderating it so well for us. And this topic themes, the theme seems to remain in the headline. So maybe we can have some other discussion on some, other aspects, and maybe we can take up the other questions which our viewers have been sending to us. They are still sending to us. So we'll take up some other time other questions regarding this topic. Thank you once again.
Manas, I'm happy to send those questions to me on email. I'm happy to, at some point respond.
Oh, that will be wonderful. Yeah. That will be wonderful. Isn't it, Siddharth? That's
absolutely. I mean, absolutely.
And that's truly what I was calling a masterclass, where we can learn so much through emails also. So thank you so much. Thank you, viewers. And you were live on the YouTube channel of the Indian Express. You can come back and view this episode and keep telling us what more to do. So we'll be back with another topic, another expert, and another day. We'll take up your queries in the Explain Live by the Indian Express. This is Manas Srivastav signing off.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. Thank you, Manas.
Thank you, Dr. Chinoy.